Another fragment contains the wife of Bud's prologue and tale, the friar's tale and the summoner's tale. The wife of Bud's prologue is one of the high points of the Canterbury Tales. The character creates herself as she talks, strong-willed, opinionated, highly sexed, frank, humorous, and masterful. Her account of her 5 hostile bands, her defense of human frailty and arguments against chastity as a practicable ideal, the gusto and vigor and uninhibited relish of her talk, present a character at once highly individualized and the first of her type that has had many successes in English fiction. In spite of her appeal to experience rather than authority, she can quote authorities with the best. For the anti-feminist arguments which the wife puts into the mouth of one of her former husbands as well as for aspects of the wife's own character, Chaucer drew on a great variety of sources, including the second part of the Romance of the Rose de Champagne de Maillage, Jerome's Epistola Adversus Ovinianum and Walter Map's Epistola Valeria ad Ruffinum, the non-Duce and Axer Valerius's letter to Rufinus about not marrying their wife. Seldom has such a variety of material, which includes the most important anti-feminist literature known to the Middle Ages, been so perfectly welded into a splendid original character portrait. The wife of Bath is concerned not only to defend the active use of sex in marriage IWOL bestow the hour of LMYNH in the actes and in fright of marriage, but also to insist that married happiness is only possible if the husband yields the mastery to the wife. And her tale, based on a story found in both literary and folk tradition, is designed to prove her point. It is the story of the loathly lady who turns out to be young and beautiful when the husband whom she has acquired by doing him a service which he has promised to repay in any way she asks, promises to put himself under her wise governance. The tale, told in decasyllable couplets, combines magic with touches of shrewd realism and a tone of romantic delicacy emerges at the end. This is perfectly in character, for the wife of Bath believed in love and romance though on her own terms. The Wife of Bath's Tale is the first of a series of stories which deal with the question of mastery in marriage. The theme is not pursued immediately, for the friar and the summoner, who have been spoiling for a quarrel since they interrupted the wife of Bath's autobiographical discourse with mutually offensive remarks, proceed to tell their stories at each other's expense as soon as the wife's tale has been concluded. Both stories are little masterpieces and sure brilliant handling of detail. The friar tells of a rascally summoner who meets the devil in the disguise of a yeoman and whose dishonest behavior finally puts him into the devil's power so that he is carried off to hell. The summoner replies with a coarse story of a grasping friar whose rapacity lands him in a comically humiliating situation. The picture given in this tale of the friar's visit to a sick man, his hypocritical words of comfort and advice, his infuriatingly patronizing sententiousness, is one of the finest pieces of realistic etching Chaucer ever did. The dramatic exchanges between the friar and the summoner before and between the tales provide a setting and a human interest that make the whole episode a work of art in itself. The Clerk's Tale, which begins another fragment, takes up the marriage question again. He tells of patient Griselda, a tapestry tale like the Man of Laws, presented in rhyme royal, based, as the clerk acknowledges, on a Latin story by Petrarch, which is itself a rendering of a story from Boccaccio's Decameron. This picture of wifely meekness and obedience carried to an outrageous extreme is too much for Chaucer himself, who intervenes at the end with his own comment. Griselda's deed, and eke higher patience, and both their tones buried in yeti, for which I hear in open audience, no wedded man so hardy beat as I his wife's patience in trust to find Griselda's. For in certain he shall find, O noble wives, full of he prudence, let noon humility your tongue nigh. Nay I yet no clerk have cause or diligence to write of your story, O one SW1 chain marvellous of Griselda's patience and kind. The merchant follows with the story of January and May, of an old husband and a young wife who hoodwinks him with her young lover. a curious but effective mixture of anti-feminist satire and magic. The story, told in decasyllable couplets, makes skillful use of a great variety of literary sources. The Merchant's Tale ends this fragment and another fragment begins with the Squire's Tale. An unfinished story of wonder and romance set in Surrey in the land of Tartary. It has the naive enjoyment of wonders appropriate to the young squire. And its Arabian Nights atmosphere still has a certain appeal. Milton referred to it in his El Allegro as the half-told story of Cambusque and Bold. The Franklin's Tale, which follows in this fragment, continues the marriage debate. It is a gentle and charming tale of a loving wife who, through no fault of her own, becomes involved in a promise to yield herself to another lover. Her husband, recognizing that promises must be kept, advises his wife in tears that she must fulfill her promise. The young man, when the lady presents herself to him and tells him in bitter grief that she is prepared to go through with it, releases her from her promise, and he in turn, who is indebted to a learned man for the means of having the lady put in his power, is released from payment of the large sum which he was to be charged for the service. Courtesy and franchise prevail, and Maestry gives way to gentilesse. This is the final answer to the problem of who is to have the maestry in marriage. Love will not being constrained by Maestry, when Maestry cometh, the god of love and on beateth his wings and farewell, he is gone. The husband, the lover, and the clerk in the end all vie with each other in courteous and free behavior, and the Franklin concludes by asking his audience which was the most afraid. As Thungatho, another fragment begins with the physician's tale, the doleful story of Appius in Virginia, in which the daughter is killed by her father rather than be yielded to the lust of a corrupt judge. It is probably an earlier story of Chaucer and does not read like his mature work. The host is upset by the story and thinking he knows his man turns to the pardoner for a merry tale. Thou be me, thou pardoner, he sighed, te. Some mirth or jips right anon. The pardoner demands a drink first and then somewhat the worse for liquor, for he has had more than one drink of cordial that day. He begins. What he says constitutes perhaps the most brilliant single passage in all of Chaucer's work. Somewhat affronted by the host's assumption that he is capable only of a merry tale, he begins by telling his audience of his skill and virtuosity as a pardoner. But he is so anxious to display his cleverness, and his natural caution has been dissipated by drink, that he reveals himself as an unscrupulous trickster who uses false relics in every kind of dishonest cunning to wring money out of even the poorest people. He tells how he preaches, how he blackmails the congregation into giving him money, how he impresses, bullies, frightens, and overwhelms his hearers. It is a picture of extraordinary virtuosity, whose motive is wholly evil. Having thus vindicated his cleverness at the expense of his character, he proceeds to his story, which is not a merry tale but another example of his professional skill. An exemplum, a story with a moral to move and impress his hearers. His tale of the three writers who set out to find death and find him unknowingly in a heap of treasure for soul, possession of which each treacherously kills the others, is perfectly done. Beginning with overt moralizing, which rises to an eloquent attack on drunkenness, he proceeds to paint a vivid picture of the riotous, blasphemous, and avaricious young men at the tavern. The story then moves with somber speed to its violent conclusion. It is a professional performance of the very highest quality. Having completed the story, the pardoner, idled by the momentum of his own eloquence or deceiving himself into believing that his eloquence and narrative skill have effaced the effect of his earlier self-revelation, offers to sell the company pardons. Paraventure tahar may fallen QON to down of his or and break his neck at wo. Lock which a surety is it you while that I am in yo phage laveship I fall, that I may a soul tilde yo. Bade more in less van that the soul shall for the body passe. I read that or a roost here shall begin, for he is most enveloped in sin. Come forth, sire host, and utter first anon. And thou shalt kiss the relics every shone, yea, for a great unbakelen on thy pores. This invitation to kiss for a fee relics which he has already confessed a pig's bones naturally outrages the host, who replies with eloquent coarseness. The professional virtuosity of his tale clearly was not enough to pull the wool over the eyes of a tough-minded character like Harry Boley. The pardoner is enraged by his reply to his suggestion, and the knight has to intervene to restore order. Another fragment begins with the shipman's tale, an amusing fablio with the fork sauce. There is some evidence that it was originally intended for the wife but and was transferred to the shipman after Chaucer had decided to give the wife another story instead. It is another tale of the wife and her lover fooling the husband. The Prioress tale, which follows, is a miracle of Our Lady, the story of little Saint Hugh of Lincoln murdered by cursed Daiches for singing a hymn to the Virgin as he walked through the Jews' quarter. It would of course be unrealistic and anachronistic to imagine that Chaucer or any of his contemporaries would have seen the fantastic and cruel libel perpetrated by such a story. There were no Jews in England in Chaucer's day, and they were known to Englishmen of the time solely in tildemus of anti-Semitic folklore. If we forget the implications, the story has a naive charm which reflects something of the character of its teller. It is told in rhyme royal and represents one of Chaucer's most assured handlings of this stanza. The host then turns to Chaucer himself and sided thus, "What man art thou?" quod he, "Thou lookest as thou wouldest find in hair, for a year upon the ground I see thee stare." "Cheer up," says the host to the timid and humble Chaucer of Elvis Contenance, tells us a tilder of more than that anon, whose tilde quod I debeth nat developed. For the tale certes can I noon, but for iro lem Lanjagoon, so the author of the Canterbury Tales. Representing himself as the least skilled of all the narrators, this kind of humor was characteristic of him. We remember his respectful monosyllables before the eagle in the House of Fame. Embarks on Sir Thopas, that brilliant parody of the metrical romance. In the steady plod of the meter, in the mechanical piling up of detail, in the long catalogues of objects in the language, situation and tone, Sir Thopas burlesques all the main characteristics of run-of-the-mill popular romance in English verse. We have quoted from it in Chapter 2, but 2 more stanzas, illustrating the cataloguer of the knight's physical attributes, will give some idea of the burlesque element. Sir Thopas waxed dirty swelled, but was his face as a pain, his lips red as rose. His road is ivike scarlet in grain, and I tell in good certain he had a seemly nose. His hair, his bird was ivike saffro, that to his girdle rote dune, his shoon of cordevane. Of Bruges his hosen brown, his robe was of cycleton, that cost many a jane. The host shuts him up after some 30 stanzas. Now more of this, for godes tilde ignite, quod ore justa. For thou makest me so weary of thy very lewdness that also busily God my soul bless io underscore tilde underscore myne sucking of thy drasty perche. Now sweater riro the devil I bite shall this me baby riro dog all, quod he. Chaucer then offers to tell a little tongue in prose, which turns out to be the long, tedious moralizing tale of MLB, translated from the French. Whether Chaucer meant this to sound as it is to modern ears is not quite clear. He may not have been aware of how lacking in artistry his prose was compared to his verse. At any rate, the host approved of the tale, and expressed the wish that his wife had the patience advocated and practiced by Meliboe's wife Prudence. The host then calls on the monk to tell a tale, assuming, as he had done with the pardoner, that this secular-minded cleric will tell something lively. He addresses the monk in a tone of cheerful agreement with his assumed opinion that clerical celibacy was a bad thing. But the monk's professional dignity is offended, and he tells a series of tragedies. The Cassibus Virorimiustrum tragedy, to the medieval mind, was a story of reversal of fortune from high to low. As the monk says, Tragedies to say in a certain story, as 8 books make on us memory of him that stood in great prosperity, and as I fallen out of a degree into misery, and endeth wretchedly. This is presumably an earlier work of Chaucer's. It tells, in 8-line stanzas rhyming above CBC, of the falls of Lucifer, Adam, Samson, Hercules, Nabucodonosor, Balthazar, Zenobia, Pedro, King of Castile, Peter, King of Cyprus, Bernabo Visconti, Ugolino, C. Dante's Inferno, Canto 23, which was presumably Chaucer's source, Nero, Holofernes, Antiochus, Alexander, Julius Caesar, and Croesus, before he is interrupted by the knight who can stand no more of these dreary stories, who, quoth good sire, now more of this. That ye ha said is right enough, ywis. And moo shall moor for light. Heaviness is right enough to mooch for, I Jesse, and the host agrees fervently. Sire monk, now more of this, so God you bless. You tale no tell this company. He asks the monk for a story of hunting, but the monk replies sullenly that he doesn't want to play. The nun's priest is now called upon. The nun's priest's tale of Chanticleer and Partelote is perhaps the best known of all Chaucer's works, and justly so, for it represents Chaucer at absolutely the top of his form. The quiet, realistic opening describing the poor widow and her way of life, the account of the cock and the hen with its superb satire on human marital relationships, the use of learning in the discussion of the causes and meaning of dreams with the deftly drawn differences of approach between Chanticleer and Partelote, the ironic effect achieved by the application of human psychology to the behavior of the birds, all this has been discussed and praised often enough. Drawing on material from the medieval beast epic and on medieval notions of medicine, astrology, and psychology, Chaucer has produced a story so aerated with wit, so cunningly wrought at all points, so artfully blended of mockery and sympathy, of irony and understanding, that the traditional nature of the materials is lost sight of in the brilliant finish of the performance. But there is much of medieval thought and attitude in the tale, which in fact makes one of the handiest windows onto the Middle Ages for anybody who wishes to enter directly into that world. Yet the story is permanently modern, kept alive by artistry, wit and insight into human, presented as animal weakness. Another fragment begins with the second nun's prologue and tale. These are conventional religious performances, probably written by Chaucer considerably earlier. The prologue contains an invocation to the Virgin Mary, drawing on a variety of sources including the Paradiso and several Latin hymns, and the tale itself is an account in rhyme royal of the life and martyrdom of Saint Cecilia. The company are then enlivened by the appearance of a canon and his yeoman, who join them after hard riding. The canon is an alchemist, and the yeoman tells the company something of his master's methods for tricking people out of their money, which so enrages and shames the canon that he rides off again. The yeoman then tells his tale, which differs from all the others in that it is represented as something in which he was recently involved. It is the story of an elaborate plot on his master's part to obtain money fraudulently from credulous people who imagined that his alchemy could obtain riches for them. The theme was common enough in Chaucer's time, but it is told here with an immediacy and a freshness that correspond perfectly to the situation out of which it is made to arise. Another fragment contains the manciple's prologue and tale. The prologue contains a lively quarrel between the manciple and the cook, the latter of whom is drunk. The manciple's brief tale is of the telltale crow who tells the husband of his wife's infidelity. It was a story common in one form or another throughout Europe and the Orient. Finally, there is in another fragment the parson's prologue and tale, which follows directly after the manciple's tale, for it begins with a reference to its having just ended. The host asks the parson for a story, and the parson replies that he will tell no story but a sermon. Why, hold air and draff out of my fate, when I may so wetty, if that me lest. But tristeth way, I am a Southron man, I can not geese ram rough by letter, nay, God boot rim holder I but little better. He does not hold with the alliterative poetry of the North or with rhyme. He will tell his tale in prose to nut up all this feast and make an ender. He then delivers a long sermon on penitence, which includes a treatise on the 7 deadly sins. The prose is somewhat featureless, and the work is more interesting to students of medieval preaching than to the literary critic. It. In all the manuscripts which contain the complete tale is Chaucer's retraction, a conventionally pious renunciation of his works of worldly vanities, including the Troilus, the House of Fame, the Legend of Good Women, the Parliament of Fowls, and those of the Canterbury Tales that sown into sin. Neo-orthodoxy hails this as a commendable turning from this world to eternity. But it is difficult to be satisfied with a point of view which so blindly renounces what has made a man immortal. The conclusion is self-evident. With Chaucer, the English language and English literature grew at a bountiful maturity. No other Middle English writer has his skill, his range, his complexity, his large humane outlook. Unfortunately, the English language, as Chaucer foresaw in a stanza at the end of Troilman Cresside, was still in the process of rapid change, and major shifts in pronunciation and accentuation were to occur in the following century and a half. This meant that Chaucer's achievement in establishing English as a fully developed literary language could not be adequately exploited by his immediate successors. It was not long before readers were unable to skin him properly. This fact helps to emphasize Chaucer's loneliness. His followers lack both his technical brilliance and his breadth of vision, leaving him the one undisputed master in medieval English literature. Not until Shakespeare is there an English writer with Chaucer's combination of technique and insight, and his ability to put each at the service of the other, and Shakespeare's genius, which was the greater, ran in different channels. But no other English narrative poet is his equal. The large canvas on which the Canterbury Tales 8 painted, the varied view of humanity in action which Chaucer gives us, were later to become characteristic qualities of English literature, represented in both the drama and, later, the novel. The often quoted phrase of Dryden's, "Here is God's plenty," referring to the Canterbury Tales, can be applied to much in Shakespeare, Fielding, and Dickens, to name only a few. However, much attention is paid to the principal character or characters in the foreground. English dramatists and novelists have had a fondness for filling in the background with a large range of characters diminishing in subtlety but not in life the further in the background they are. Men tend to be seen against the colorful pattern of a stratified society rather than only in intimate relation with the select few in contact with whom their destiny is determined. This is not, of course, always true, and less true of tragedies than of other kinds of work. Compare Othello with Henry IV, for example, or Johnson's Bartholomew Fair with his Sienus. But on the whole, the crowded canvas with the characters shading off from fully realized individuals. If Chaucer's work helped to make the East Midland dialect of Middle English into the English literary language, we are reminded by the work of his contemporary, John Gower, died 1408, who wrote in French and in Latin as well as in English, that the claims of the other two languages were still strong. French, however, was rapidly giving way to English, and it is significant that his three major works, Speculum Meditantis or Mirvad the Homalpox Clamantis, the first is French in its Anglo-Norman variety and the last, written toward the end of his career with Chaucer's example before him, is in English. Gower's reputation has been eclipsed by Chaucer's, but he was popular in his own day and was still read by the Elizabethans. He is a more typical representative of his age and class than Chaucer could claim to be, conservative, moralistic, drawing with considerable technical skill but without any great originality of perception or liveliness of imagination on the traditional materials that were available to him. His long French poem is a manual of sins and sinners, a detailed and gloomy account of the prevalence of vice springing from man's corrupt nature. Repentance is, of course, the remedy. The vox clamantis, a dream allegory in Latin, deals with the peasants' revolt of 1381, giving a savagely gloomy picture of violence and disorder and of the general corruption of the age. The Confessio Amantis is a collection of tales in English octosyllabic couplets linked by a not very helpful framework. The poet announces, with a certain reluctance, that he will leave morality for loveful readers prefer the latter. He then describes the conventional May morning, with himself going out into a wood and meeting Venus, the queen of love, who advises him to make his confession to Genius, her priest. Genius considers it necessary to discuss the 7 deadly sins, with the numerous sub-sins in each category, and he proceeds to illustrate each one by a story. It is these stories which make up the main material of the poem. The relation between the story and the sin it is meant to illustrate is often forced and sometimes preposterous, and it would have been better if Gower had rid himself altogether of this cumbrous machinery. But the tales themselves are told with a quiet skill. Gower lacks altogether Chaucer's vivacity and humour. He tends to be merely fluent. Here, for example, is part of his description of the cave of sleep from his tale of Ceyx in Alcyone, which Chaucer told in the book of the Daiches. Under an hen there is a cave which of the sonaril I know have, so that no man may know at the point between the die and nyht. There is no fyr, there is no spark. There is no door, which may jark creek whereof and yhe shoya and sket fan I shufa opened, so that inward there is no let. The stories are interspersed with digressions on a great variety of subjects. His views are always the conventional views of his ages. There is no originality in his imagination or in his ideas. The constant moralizing wearies, and though many of the tales hold the interest, the smooth flow of over 30,000 lines becomes infinitely tiresome. Moral Gower, as Chaucer called him in the dedication of the Daiches, is one of the most interesting examples in medieval English literature of verse craftsmanship without genius. He is an excellent mirror of his ages. He is more disturbed by the upheavals in contemporary society than Chaucer ever shows himself to be, but he is a dull fellow, lacking the true spark, and we cannot read him for any length of time without making historical allowances. Moral in a more passionate and personal way, and more deeply concerned with the religious, social, and economic problems of his time, is the author of Piers Plowman, an impressive allegorical poem or series of related poems written in the old alliterative meter in the latter part of the 14th century. The author is traditionally taken to be William Langland, and he certainly refers to himself as Will in the poem, but the attribution is uncertain. And in any case it is possible that the later 2 of the 3 main versions of the poem which exist represent revisions and alterations by one or more other writers. The prologue describes how the author fell asleep on a May morning on the Malvern Hills and saw in a dream a fair felder full of folk, with ploughmen, wasters, hermits, merchants, jesters, beggars, pilgrims, and friars, each going about his business. The list closes with a pardoner with his papal bulls offering to assail the people, and neglectful priests deserting their licks for an easy life in London. A king appears, and an angelic voice admonishes him in Latin to follow justice and mercy. Then, with that dream logic where one scene suddenly transforms itself into another, we find a group of rats and mice deciding to put a bell on the cat so that they can have warning of his approach. Then, finding none of them willing to tie the bell onto the cat, and finally being warned that that is not how to handle the problem of a dangerous ruler, the prologue ends with another crowded picture of the social scene, with barons, burgesses, tradesmen, and artisans of different kinds, labourers, and innkeepers crying hot pies at the doors of their taverns. We can see at once that this is a new use of the dream allegory. The gentle movement of the traditional variety of love vision, generally told in rhymed couplets, has here given way to the more vigorous rhythms of the older alliterative line, obviously handled by someone who had long been familiar with it. There is a rapidity and a bustling quality about the verse, a sense of men at work that is not easily paralleled in medieval English literature. A fair field full of folks fondi thereby tween. Of all manner of men the many in the reach virtuing and wandering as the world asketh. Some putting hame to the plough full sides in satyingen and sowing swanken full hard. And wonnen that waste to us with gluttony's destriate. And some putting hame to provide a paralled ham thereafter in continence of clothing corner disgust. In prayers and in penance putting hame man yea. Alpha lower of our lordly Odin full straight in hope for to our humanerish bliss. There preached a pardoner as he arised brought forth a bull with bishop's cellus. And sighed that hy himself might soiling hamila falshed a fasting of vow broken. The vision then develops into an allegorical interpretation of life. The first passes the name given to the divisions of the poem introduced Holy Church, a fair lady who expounds the way of salvation to the dreamer. In the second, Lady Medea reward. Bribery appears richly dressed and is to be married to falsehood, but theology objects and the various characters proceed to London to have the matter decided by the king. The king threatens punishment to falsehood and the other figures surrounding Lady Medea, flattery, guile, who run off and leave Medea alone to face the court. In the third passus, Medea tries her tricks on the justices. She confesses to a friar and is shriven, and makes a good impression by promising to pay for new windows in a church, which leads the author to utter a warning against those who hope to attain heaven by having their names engraved as benefactors on ch windows. That is not the way to salvation. She recommends the acceptance of bribes to mayors and justices. The king is fooled and proposes a marriage between Medea and Conscience. Hath Conscience objects and delivers a formidable indictment of the lady. Some lively argument follows, in the course of which Conscience gives an eloquent account of a time coming when shall no more Medea be master as she is now the AC love and owness and looter togadias. Thais shall be masters on Malde truth he to save. Passus IV develops the argument with wit, wisdom, peace, reason, and wrong taking part. The king is convinced by reason in the end, and asks him to stay with him always. In passus V the poet awakes briefly, then falls asleep again and thansa more chemo. He sees the same field full of folk, and describes first reason preaching to the people that recent plagues and tempests were punishment for sin. The 7 deadly sins here reasons call to repentance and are moved to repent. This introduces one of the liveliest and most interesting sections of the poem. Pride, luxury, envy, wrath, avarice, gluttony, and sloth, each personified, give accounts of themselves before their repentance, and some of these accounts, taken together with the author's description, amount to brilliantly drawn portraits. There is of course no more individualization than is necessary to make the particular vice clear and to illuminate the behavior which it implies. But within these limits the character drawing is vivid and skillful. The most appealing is the picture of gluttony in the tavern, where he stops on his way to church. The interior of a medieval tavern is described with Hogarthian realism. Gluttony's fellow drinkers are not personifications, but real people. Ceci the suitress sat on the bench, female shoemaker, what the warner and hyswyf both Tim the tinkere and twain of his prentice, Hill the hackneyman and Hage the nadela. Clarice of Caucus Lane and the clucker of the shesh, do the dickery and a dozen other. Ditcher, the level of the allegory is not consistent. Gluttony is a gluttonous person, who does not repent until he has made himself drunk and awakes 2 days later with a hangover. Sloth appears to be a self-indulgent and lazy priest who prefers to read rhymes of Robin Hood to performing his priestly duties. The repentant company then depart from mind to journey in search of truth. But they do not know the way. It is at this point that Piers Plowman first appears on the scene. The company have vainly inquired of a returned pilgrim if he knows where a saint called Truth is to be found. Then Pete quoted Plowman and put forth his heed. I know him as kindly as Clark doth his bouquets. Conscience and kind wit can me to his place. Piers takes over the moral leadership of the company and tells them the way to truth in Bunyanesque allegorical geography. This passage ends with the partner deciding that he cannot go without his papal bulls and letters of indulgence, and a CPM woman telling Piers simply that she will follow him. Passage Y continues the story. Piers says he will act as guide to the company after he has ploughed his half-acre. He gives further moral advice to the company, in particular to a knight who recognizes his duty to protect the church and the common people. Piers directs everybody to hard work, and those who shirk are disciplined by hunger. A discussion of labor, wages, and similar economic factors, which illustrates the author's conservative view of such matters. He is looking back to an ideal stability before the present discontents, concludes this passage. In passage 7, truth sends Piers a pardon intended for all, though lawyers and merchants are eligible only with reservations, and a priest argues against its validity. The priest says that he can find no pardon there, but only a statement that those who do well shall find salvation and those who do evil shall not. The ensuing argument awakens the dreamer, and the passage concludes with the poet's passionate remarks on the superiority of good works to indulgences and papal bulls as means of pardon. The remainder of Piers Plowman, most of it existing only in the two later versions, contains the vision of Dowell, do well, Dobbit, do better, and Dobbist. It is difficult to follow the somewhat rambling course of the prologues and 10 passages of this extension of the poem. The author seems to be allowing his moral views and his religious emotion to dictate the poem at any point, and lively contemporary references drawn moments of religious passion and had didactic passages jostle each other. The author does not seem to have been able to subdue his material to an adequate literary form, but the main design is nevertheless visible. Underlying all the digressions, outbursty, symbolic incidents, moral indignation, prophecies, preaching, and visions is the notion of the quest, the search for the good life, for salvation, for truth, and for God. This search can be conducted on different levels and described from different points of view, and almost anything that men can do or think or feel or imagine is relevant to it. As the poem proceeds and the lives of Dowell, Dobbit, and Dobbist unfold with all the digressions and excursions, we get a picture of the fight against evil carried on simultaneously on different planes: the fight for the spirit against the dead letter, the fight against corruption in the church, the fight against false religion. Faith, hope, and charity constitute the way. They follow from one another, culminating in charity, as Dobbit follows Dowell to culminate in Dobbist. The account of Dowell concludes with a triumphant description of the victory of life over death, of light over darkness, the meeting of truth and mercy, of peace and righteousness. With Christ's descent into hell and his victory over Satan, the poet wakes to hear the joyous pealing of Easter bells. But in the ensuing account of Dobbist we see Antichrist taking control after Christ's departure, and a sad picture of corruption and decay on the earth succeeds. Piers Plowman now reappears as a symbol of Christ himself, of God quasi homo, and of God's grace vouchsafed to all men. With a picture of a hard-fought psychomachia, the vices pressing the virtues hard, and with conscience finally rousing himself to seek in pilgrimage for Piers Plowman in his new symbolic meaning, the dream concludes and the poet awakes in tears. Though it lacks artistic unity and the author shows only sporadic control over his material, Piers Plowman is a remarkable work with its alternation of bitter satire and tenderness, of vivid description of contemporary life and the stringing together of Latin tags, of social realism and religious vision. And the handling of the alliterative line is always easy and confident. There is none of Chaucer's relish of the human scene as a human scene, nor of his joy in his verbal artistry. Piers Plowman is the work of a religious idealist who is genuinely distressed by the social and moral condition of England, and who is endeavouring to create a large and cumulative vision of what is wrong and where we must look for improvement. If the two later versions represent the work of other writers, then it seems clear that the original author succeeded in creating a tradition, a vehicle for carrying both a satirical and a religious content, which was exploited by those similarly troubled. There is something of the popular imagination as well as of the individual vision in Piers Plowman. Even in its most visionary moments, it is never private. The author is always thinking of the people. And in Piers himself he creates a symbol who eventually united the ideal of the common man with the ideal of God-made man. Like Chaucer, the author of Piers Plowman made use of traditional material, and they both draw on the facts of contemporary society, but what different pictures they present. The difference is one of attitudes, both personal and social, and it is a salutary check to hasty generalizations about the spirit of an age to consider that the same age produced Piers Plowman in the Canterbury Tales.